So today, what we're going to do is we're going to follow up on the previous video about this whole concept of care and how to deliver on care. So I'm going to talk about going from care to action and how to build an architecture around this whole concept and how we can together as a community of practice of entrepreneurs can work together. So care only changes the world when it's designed into a system. Just because you and I care about something, we might even protest or take some action about something. But unless there's a system to work together, we're not going to be able to move things forward, at least not in a way where we actually can build businesses around this and build successful startups. So good intentions collapse if there's not a structure. The idea is that we need to have a structure. You might even think about it from this standpoint of, I say, a production system. How is it we work with each other? How is it we make things happen? A lot of times movements will die if there's not a system. What we want to do is recognize that a lot of large corporations have someone at the top who's driving signals, whereas you and I don't work for each other. I don't work for you. You don't work for me. In our community of practice, no one's working for any other. So how do we actually coordinate the system? That's a really important idea. And if the care isn't built into the incentives, what happens out of this? It ends up just disappearing at some point. It's a great idea and it feels good, but then it just sort of disappears. Let's talk about how we can drive this forward. I've got this idea about how is it we can build a framework of coordinating all of these entrepreneurs together. And through that framework, we can work and drive results. Now, this is based on my experience of working with entrepreneurs over the last 22 years. At one point, we had 800 entrepreneurs in this network. And just, working together these little bits, and it helped us transform the city into the entrepreneurial powerhouse it is. What we want to do now is take this to a whole different level. So the first 4 moves that we have to have into creating these kind of outcomes. The question is, who do you convene? Who do you bring together to work around these things? How do you make commitments to each other? You don't work for me, I don't work for you, but we have to coordinate our commitments together about what we're doing. The third is, how do we collaborate? How do we collaborate? I think of this as a production system. You might imagine on the manufacturing floor of any kind of manufacturing plant, you have to have ways of collaborating and coordinating what's happening on the manufacturing floor to really drive a result. And then how do we take this a compound value? How do we go from these little structures of just a handful of us? Now, what's really interesting to point to some ideas about this, a lot of my concepts are based on what I see happening in the open source software space. The main thing about it is the moves that we have in coordinating a group of startups, a group of ventures together, a group of entrepreneurs together, have to look similar. And we can certainly learn things from the open source software developers that are working out there. So there's a way of seeing that there's power in this group of people, but how do we actually go from there? Let's talk about that. So the first move is convening the right people. Care starts with who we're bringing to the table together. That is, we don't want to optimize for prestige. It's not about having like the big name. It's about optimizing for a contribution. Who has the insight? Why is it we're coordinated together? Why do we even care about this one set of issues? The next one is mixing operators, builders, and problem holders. And we're bringing in other people around them that are technology startups to say, here's some solutions. Here's the base level of the problem set. How do we actually coordinate those individuals? And we want to do this as designing tables for interaction versus audiences. Too many people are using the technology that's out there right now and just broadcasting to an audience. My intent and our intent in sharing this concept, this care infrastructure, is okay, instead of it just being about broadcasting out, we want to talk about how we coordinate together. The second move is replace the transaction with commitment. You might think about it this way. A lot of entrepreneurial stories out there right now, especially in some of the concepts that I see, are just transactions between people. So when I say commitment, first there has to be a relationship. The right people have to be at the table to then build those commitments with each other to actually have a higher output, to solve whatever the underlying problem that that group of entrepreneurs and problem holders are actually taking on together. In the School of Philosophy, there's this idea called speech acts. When you imagine that this wall behind me right here, at one point before the wall appeared, was one person talked to another person about, we want to have a wall here, we want to have a, structure overhead of us. The world starts with words, right? It's a very simple concept. The key thing, though, is as we build an infrastructure together, we need to figure out what are the right words to build that. Now, the general concept, and I'll tell you more about this in the future, the idea is we're working in speech acts. How is it that we coordinate that? Any of you that have been to one of my campfires before, they're very simple speech acts. What's your name? What's your offer? What's your request? Those are some ideas. And then we have a handful of shared agreements on top of that. Our agreements about how we're going to interact with each other, especially if we're working with, entrepreneurs in Mexico and entrepreneurs in Texas. And perhaps as an earlier today, I was working with an entrepreneur in Hungary, and I was talking to individuals in Finland, right? We have to have some shared agreements about what it means, how we're engaging and things like that, kind of level set across that way, because it's from this that we can build trust. And the way we build trust is the trust that's inherent in the system then lowers the cost of coordination. That is, when you have a group of, just collaborators that you already have built some measure of trust with, you can go much farther, much faster. The third move is design collaboration, not competition. A lot of people say, hey, competition is king. Like in the United States, we have this concept that competition is king. But the truth is, even in the US was built on collaborations. You can see it over the years. And sometimes this is forgotten in startups. But part of the idea is that you and I can work together. By working together, we can actually make things happen faster. If your startup or your venture has one part of the solution that I need, and we're up against these large corporations who are blocking care in a specific area, like say healthcare. Part of what we want to do is get to figure out how can we plug your tools in with my tools, because the competition is not each other. It's the existing situation. The enemy is the underlying problem set that has whatever problem that's not being addressed. Healthcare in the United States is a great example. There's so many incumbents, large corporations that are blocking interaction, that what we want to do is figure out, okay, how can we create those collaborations so that you and I can move forward? Or actually, we could actually have 10 different companies moving forward and working with each other, because this system will outperform any individual company. It will outperform any individual venture. And so part of what we're doing is, I call this an attention commons. A commons is a place where we might share back and forth insight. In our work, part of what we do is we build this attention commons, in that if all of us knew that there's this area here where I can request support for whatever the problem set I might be up against, or I need a collaborator of some type to work on a problem set together. I've got this large example customer. Actually, right now, TechRanch has a large project in another state. And instead of me trying to put together a really large team, what I'm doing is I'm tapping into 3 other organizations so that we can go to market together. And so by doing that, I can request support for areas that have nothing to do with what we're doing and what our capabilities, and other ones as well can do that. That's an attention commons, a commons that has us paying attention to what's happening there and creates opportunities for us to solve problems in that space. And then part of what we want to do is normalize requesting support. The idea is, at some point, if I come up against a certain block in building my venture, I can actually request into this attention commons for support. One of the things we can learn from the open source software space is they have this concept that for any body of code, any body of software that's there, the more eyes you have looking at the code, the faster you can discover bugs and solve those bugs. Same concept is possible for, say, there's a large group of us where 5 minutes of your insight at the right time in my startup or my venture's history can be worth $10,000. Part of what we're doing is for these core issues like this, we're able to actually have a group of people that say, hey, I'll gladly give you a little bit of insight. It kind of advertises the capabilities of that other party. But what it does is it starts the collaborations. Now, the collaborations could be the 5 minutes of insight, or it could end up becoming a collaborator that you go to business with. You go to market together. I've seen both happen. They're really powerful. The key idea is to have that system. So let's go to the fourth move, culture. How do we actually compound value across all the different people that are there? I'll give you an example. How is it that Austin, Texas went from not being listed on any of the startup lists about places to be in the startup world to now it's in the top? I've seen it in the top 10, but I've definitely seen it in the top 16 globally. Part of what happened about that was we had the culture of, I call it hippie musicians, where they, Janis Joplin and Willie Nelson. I'll help you play in your band. You'll help me play in my band. So an entrepreneur like me, who worked for a Steve Jobs startup in California, but wanted to come back to Austin because I missed this culture where, I care about you, you care about me. We're going to take care of each other. That cultural idea is really powerful. In fact, there's this whole idea that culture eats strategy for lunch. That concept is really how we compound this to take it to a different level. Culture determines how people behave when there's no contract or incentive among us. How is it that we work with each other? What can we expect from each other? What normalizes things? This drops the cost of how much money you're going to have to spend because there's inherent trust in how we're interacting with each other. This is one of the powerful things about Austin, Texas. And this is part of what we want to bring to the world. The second idea is these shared norms, whether you're in Finland, Texas, Japan, or Mexico, and you're working with each other, we reduce the amount of friction and increase the speed that happens between this community, this community, this community, this community. We speed things up about how we what can you expect when you're stepping in to work with another entrepreneur on the other side of the world? What's possible? And then the idea that makes this really come to accumulation point is that the strongest networks compound value because culture just creates this repeat trust. Really simple concept, right? Two people start working together. They get used to working with each other side by side, but then you start multiplying that where you have groups of entrepreneurial companies happen. You see this happening in the open source world. We want to draw that in to this notion about how you and I build structures of care about, we're going to go figure out how to drive business that drives care. The idea is that this culture is really what makes that powerful, that creates the repeat process that then compounds what's possible among us. So the main idea about this is then using this as our market strategy to drive care. A lot of entrepreneurs come to me and say, hey, I really care about the world. I'm really concerned about what's happening out there. But a lot of times they go quiet because they don't see the way to actually plug in. This is the way we plug in. And part of what we can do is with this concept, this is how we can drive taking on the suffering that's driving demand. That we can actually look for that are not being served, that perhaps it's going to take a bigger risk to even address. And we can figure out how, by the dynamics of working across country boundaries, cross technology boundaries, cross insight boundaries, to take on that suffering and treat it as if it's a market problem. That's where we can get this leverage. That's a really important concept. It's by this insight and sharing these needs and surfacing them, we can actually start creating opportunities to identify and then take out those issues and use market-based systems for doing so. And then because of this, one of the great things about this is markets solve root problems. That is, we can take on any problem set and design the model around taking on issues where it's even just one at a time, and then figure out how can we collectively put together the right pieces so that a business model comes out of that between your company, my company, and a handful of other companies. That's really how this gets into what we can do together. What I want to do, I'm giving you a lot of concepts. And I know a lot of times when we go over concepts, sometimes concepts can be limiting. You might say, hey, great, all that sort of stuff is great, Kevin. It's very conceptual. I'm not so certain about what you're actually saying. So what I want to do is I want to challenge you to take one action per day around this. There are 4 different domains that you can do so. The main thing is to stop pitching and start convening. Yes, we all need to go after investor money and things like that, but start convening people together. Part of the thing that's been lost, especially here in the United States, is we've forgotten how to build community, about how to convene around different issues, how to meet up. Now, TechRanch certainly has that, and you have communities of practice that you can plug into here. But the number one thing is if you're not already connected to a group of entrepreneurs that are helping you solve problems together, even if it's just internal problems, not even worrying about care problems in the world. Part of what I want you to do is to find that group of people and start today. The second thing is stop hoarding your insight. If every time there is someone that has a need and you're kind of saying, well, I'll only tell you if I actually have a multi-$1,000 contract with you. There are times that, yes, you should reserve your time for your business, but what I want you to do is to find the community to plug into so that you can, share that insight that you have. A little bit of the insight is a great thing to share. Now, it could lead to customers, it could lead to collaborators, other things like that as well. So that's something to think about. And then stop chasing scale and start building trust. In the market that's coming, and especially the financial situations that are coming, part of what I think we're going to see is we're going to see a dip in the market, a dip in the amount of cash that's available for both investment as well as just customers to be able to work together. And so instead of just like totally focusing on scale, right now is a good time to be building trust among the parties that are at the table with you. It's through that we can actually take this community of practice concept and start really getting ready for what could be and what are signaled to be fairly harsh financial situations that are coming. The invitation then is, like I said, I want to make sure that we take this conceptual framework and start looking at 4 different things, 4 different domains, like I mentioned. Who can you convene with today? Who can you just get together and start the conversations? The second is commitments. Part of the thing about making commitments back and forth is when we're exploring new territory, we can commit to each other about how we're going to move forward into that. Now, I'm not saying make a year-long commitment for something you haven't figured out how to make the first dollars out of. But part of the thing about it is you can say, hey, I'm going to commit to you how we're going to go explore this market together as 2 different entrepreneurs with 2 different ventures. Or actually, it gets even more powerful when there's more people at the table than just 2, but we can start thinking about it. The third thing is create. It's time to start creating and experimenting with all sorts of new ways of engaging. One of the clear things that's happening by the markets that are getting destroyed right now, by the downturn, the politics, the new technologies, all the disruptions, is that we need to start creating, taking action and creating together. If you're not in a collaboration with at least one other company, one other entrepreneur who is not inside your same venture in building something that's parallel or different, if you're not doing that with at least one other entrepreneurial venture at this time, you should be. Even if you've got like 50 people in your company, you need to be doing those experiments, because part of this is how we can boot up larger systems together. And the final thing is to focus on care. I mentioned this last time, and I think it's probably one of the most important things that I've thought about, spoke about in the last 15 to 20 years. The idea is this is the market that as we enter into these more difficult times, we should be thinking about how we build businesses to drive care. In down markets, one of the things that you always know is human needs are always going to be there. And one way or another, people are going to try to solve their human needs from the get-go. And so by really even focusing on those type of businesses, and I don't mean just healthcare, I mean more about how can we actually build a better world? How can we actively do that? Those are the key things. So in closing, care is not the message, it's the mechanism. I'm not just trying to say, hey, care about your fellow man and things like that. I actually want to say, in the market that comes, in the financial situations that come, this is going to be the mechanism about how you're going to be successful, period. So when we care, we deliver. We can deliver solutions. We can work together. When we, that is not just my venture or your venture, but when we figure out how to do this together, we can actually really deliver. When we care, we can scale the solutions that are there. The main idea about this is if we know that the human suffering or lack of solutions in certain areas, especially in such uncertainty happening in the world, part of what we can do is take that on together. When we care, we change the world. The main idea about this, and you've probably heard me say it, those of you that know my work for many years, it's part of the underlying concept is by working with each other, we can go do things that change the world for the better. So let's do exactly that. We'll keep on having these conversations about how to care, how to build structures, how to work on this sort of stuff together. Today's talk has been really conceptual, but part of what I want to do is start laying down the concepts with you about how we do this. So with that, let me just close with saying, let's go change the world for the better together. It's my honor to be here with you. I look forward to building these systems with you. Thank you.